The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room, an ever-present reminder of life hanging by a thread. Claire Adams adjusted the 4-line for her elderly patient, a kind woman named Mrs. Holloway, who had spent the past week recovering from pneumonia. Claire offered a reassuring smile as she adjusted the blankets around the frail woman's shoulders. "There you go, Mrs. Holloway. Comfortable?" The old woman nodded weakly, her lips curling into a small, grateful smile. "You're too good to me, dear. The world needs more nurses like you." Claire chuckled softly. "Just doing my job." But the truth was, nursing wasn't just a job to her, it was a calling. She loved taking care of people, being the steady presence in their most vulnerable moments. Yet, outside these hospital walls, Claire's efforts often went unnoticed, dismissed by those who should have valued her most. She glanced at the clock on the wall, almost the end of her shift. Relief flooded through her, though it was short-lived. Tonight, she had to face the part of her life she dreaded most, dinner at her mother-in-law's house. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Fishing it out, she saw Daniel's name flash across the screen. Her heart clenched. Her husband, the man she loved, caught in the impossible balance between his family and hers. She tapped the message open. "Dinner at Mom's tonight. Don't forget." Claire exhaled slowly. She hadn't forgotten. How could she? Margaret Donovan was impossible to ignore, a woman whose presence loomed over Claire's marriage like a dark cloud. A woman who, from the moment Claire married into the wealthy, prestigious Donovan family, made it clear she would never truly belong. "Something wrong, dear?" Mrs. Holloway's voice broke into her thoughts. Claire shook her head and forced a smile. "Just a family dinner tonight." The older woman gave her a knowing look. One of those dinners." Claire laughed, though it lacked real humor. "Exactly." She wrapped up her final patient notes, grabbed her bag from the nurse's station, and made her way out of Riverside General Hospital. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had fallen earlier. She inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the anxiety twisting in her stomach. She reminded herself that she wasn't just a nurse. She was Daniel's wife. That had to count for something. Yet, 5 years into their marriage, Margaret still saw her as a charity case, someone unworthy of the Donovan name. As she climbed into her car, her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She had endured countless family gatherings, each one a quiet test of her patience, her dignity. The pointed remarks, the polite but cold dismissal of her thoughts. The subtle reminders that, in their world, she was an outsider. And then there was Juliet. Daniel's younger sister was Margaret's mirror image. Entitled, condescending, and entirely absorbed in the high society life she had been raised in. Claire had long since stopped trying to gain her approval, knowing it was a battle she would never win. Tonight's dinner was meant to finalize the wedding plans for Juliet, a grand affair that had been the center of the Donovan family's world for months. Claire had been present at nearly every discussion, yet her opinions were either ignored or met with backhanded compliments disguised as politeness. The thought of sitting at Margaret's pristine dining table, enduring hours of veiled insults while pretending it didn't hurt, made her stomach churn. But Daniel would be there. And for him, she would go. She pulled up to the Donovan estate, Briarwood, as it was called, a sprawling mansion that exuded wealth and power. A place that had never felt like home to her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car and walked toward the grand entrance, the double doors opening before she even reached them. The butler, Thomas, gave her a stiff nod, as if merely tolerating her presence. "Mrs. Adams." "Not Mrs. Donovan." "Never that." Claire nodded politely and stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The scent of expensive perfume and roasted lamb filled the air, mingling with the tension she could already feel brewing. She spotted Margaret and Juliet in the sitting room, surrounded by swatches of silk and lace samples. Wedding planners hovered around them, taking notes on every extravagant detail. Margaret barely glanced up. "Claire." It wasn't a greeting, more of an acknowledgement that she existed. Juliet, dressed in a designer ensemble that likely cost more than Claire's monthly salary, smirked. "Oh, Claire, you're just in time. We were discussing the seating arrangements for the wedding." Claire forced a polite smile. "Sounds important." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "It is. A wedding of this magnitude requires careful planning." Claire resisted the urge to remind her that her wedding hadn't been given nearly the same level of attention. When she and Daniel married, it had been a simple, intimate affair. Margaret had barely concealed her disdain, treating it more like a scandal than a celebration. Juliet leaned back against the sofa, swirling a glass of wine in her hand. "By the way, I do hope you'll be wearing something appropriate for the wedding, Claire. It's a black tie event." Claire met her gaze evenly. "I'll make sure to dress accordingly." Margaret let out a small hum of approval, as if giving permission. Daniel entered the room then, his presence easing the suffocating atmosphere. He kissed Claire's temple, a gesture of quiet reassurance. "Glad you made it." She smiled up at him, grateful for the moment of warmth. Margaret cleared her throat. "Daniel, we need to discuss something." He turned toward his mother, already looking wary. "What is it?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Juliet's wedding expenses have slightly exceeded the budget. We were hoping you and Claire could contribute a little more." Claire stiffened. They already sent monthly checks to Margaret, more than enough to cover extravagant expenses. Daniel sighed. "Mom, we've already helped with the wedding fund." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Yes, but this is an important event for our family. Surely you wouldn't want it to be anything less than perfect." Claire knew what this was. Margaret expected her to sit there, silent and agreeable, while Daniel caved. "Not this time. We've already contributed, Margaret," Claire said evenly. "I think that's more than generous." Margaret's gaze flickered with something cold, though her voice remained smooth. "Of course, dear. I was merely asking." The tension in the room thickened, but Claire didn't look away. For once, she wasn't going to be steamrolled. The housekeeper entered just then, glancing at Claire before hesitating. "Mrs. Donovan, should I add Mrs. Adams to the list for assisting with the wedding preparations?" Claire blinked, the words sinking in. "The help." Juliet stifled a laugh. Margaret's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Oh, I'm sure she'll be very involved, one way or another." Claire's jaw tightened. She didn't belong here, and she was starting to wonder if she ever would. The Briarwood estate loomed before Claire as she stepped out of the car, its grand facade gleaming under the soft evening lights. The mansion, with its towering columns and sprawling gardens, was breathtaking, but to Claire, it had never felt like a home. Instead, it was a stage, a place where wealth and status were paraded like prized possessions. And tonight, she would once again play the role of the unwelcome outsider. She adjusted her dress, a simple yet elegant navy blue sheath, before taking a steadying breath and making her way to the front entrance. Before she could knock, the double doors swung open, revealing Thomas, the butler, who barely concealed his indifference as he stepped aside to let her in. "Mrs. Adams," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Claire nodded in acknowledgement, stepping into the grand foyer. The scent of fresh lilies and expensive perfume filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of the evening's dinner preparations. Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she moved toward the sitting room, where the voices of Margaret and Juliet carried through the space. As she entered, the conversation briefly halted. Margaret and Juliet sat on the velvet sofa, a collection of fabric swatches and wedding plans sprawled across the glass coffee table. Their matching expressions of disinterest barely wavered before they resumed their discussion. "Claire," Margaret said, not bothering to look up. It wasn't a greeting. It was a formality, a reluctant acknowledgement of her presence. Juliet, elegantly draped in a designer ensemble, cast Claire a smirk before delicately swirling the wine in her glass. "Oh, Claire, you're here. We were just finalizing the floral arrangements for the wedding. Not that you'd have much interest in such things." Claire forced a polite smile. "I'm sure it will be lovely." Margaret let out a small, dismissive hum. "Well, it needs to be more than lovely." A wedding of this magnitude requires absolute perfection. Claire knew what she meant. Juliet's wedding was a reflection of the Donovan family, an opportunity to showcase their wealth and social standing. Every detail had to be meticulously curated to maintain their image. Speaking of the wedding, Margaret continued, finally lifting her gaze to meet Claire's. Daniel and I were discussing the budget, and it seems we could use a little more financial support. Claire stiffened. We've already contributed. Margaret's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes, and we appreciate it. But unexpected expenses have arisen. A proper event requires proper funding. Proper. Claire knew what that meant. It meant extravagant floral arrangements imported from Europe, hand-sewn table linens, and an orchestra flown in from another city. It meant excess disguised as necessity. We've already given what we can, Claire said evenly, refusing to let her irritation show. Margaret sighed, as if she were speaking to a child who simply couldn't understand. I was merely asking. Juliet glanced between them, her amusement barely concealed. Mother, let's not press the issue. I'm sure Claire has her priorities. Claire clenched her jaw. Before she could respond, the housekeeper entered, glancing between them uncertainly before focusing on Margaret. Mrs. Donovan, should I add Mrs. Adams to the list for assisting with the wedding preparations? Silence. Claire's stomach twisted. Juliet let out a quiet, delighted laugh. Oh, how fitting. Margaret didn't even blink. Instead, she regarded Claire with that same detached condescension. Oh, I'm sure Claire will be very involved, one way or another. Claire's face heated, but she kept her expression neutral. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Before she could say anything, Daniel entered the room. His presence was a relief, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this family. He smiled at her before pressing a kiss to her temple. Glad you made it. Claire offered a small smile in return. Margaret cleared her throat, regaining Daniel's attention. Daniel, we need to discuss something. He turned toward her, his expression wary. What is it? Margaret folded her hands in her lap. We were just talking about the additional expenses for Juliet's wedding. I was hoping you and Claire could contribute a little more. Daniel sighed. Mom, we've already helped with the wedding fund. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Yes, but this is an important event for our family. Surely you wouldn't want it to be anything less than perfect. Claire could feel Daniel's frustration, but before he could speak, Juliet added, It's really not that much, Daniel. And it's for family. Claire's grip tightened around the edge of her clutch. Family. Daniel's jaw tensed, and for a moment, Claire thought he would argue. But then he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I'll have to look at our finances. Margaret smiled in quiet triumph. Claire's stomach turned. As dinner was served, the evening continued in much the same way. The conversation revolved around Juliet's wedding, the Donovan family's influence, and social standing. Claire sat through it, offering polite nods, while her thoughts churned. Then, as she lifted her wine glass, she noticed something in the dining room. On the grand wall, where the Donovan family portraits were displayed in elaborate gold frames, she spotted a single, much smaller picture tucked into an insignificant corner. Her wedding photo. It was dwarfed by the other images, practically hidden. As if it didn't belong. A hollow feeling settled in her chest. She had spent years trying to prove she was worthy of being part of this family. She had endured the cold treatment, the dismissive remarks, the subtle humiliations. She had stood beside Daniel, believing that love was enough to bridge the divide between her and his family. But now, looking at that tiny, insignificant picture, she wondered if she had been fooling herself all along. Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts. Claire, dear, would you be a darling and bring out the dessert? Claire hesitated. It wasn't a request. Juliet smirked, taking a sip of her wine. It's just in the kitchen, Claire. You don't mind, do you? Something inside Claire snapped. She rose slowly, setting her napkin on the table. Of course. She walked to the kitchen, her mind racing, her chest tightening with a realization that had been building for years. She was tolerated. Not accepted. Not welcomed. tolerated. And she was growing tired of it. As she carried the silver tray of desserts back to the dining room, she looked at the faces around the table. Margaret's controlled elegance. Juliet's smug superiority. The silent agreement between them that she would never, truly, be one of them. Claire set the tray down with deliberate calm, her pulse pounding. As the conversation resumed, as the laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, Claire sat quietly, her thoughts no longer of fitting in. They were of something else entirely. Something was shifting. And she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it anymore. The Grand Windsor was a spectacle of wealth, a towering monument of marble and glass that shimmered under the golden evening lights. Claire stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she gazed up at the imposing entrance. She adjusted the folds of her navy blue dress, simple yet elegant, chosen carefully to avoid unnecessary scrutiny. She had spent too many years playing this game, carefully selecting her attire, measuring her words, navigating every conversation with precision so as not to invite criticism. But tonight was Juliet's wedding, and Claire wanted, for once, to move through an evening without being made to feel like an outsider. Daniel emerged from the driver's side, adjusting his cufflinks before offering her a reassuring smile. "You look beautiful." Claire met his eyes, grateful for the warmth in his gaze. Despite everything, Daniel had always been her anchor in this family. "Thank you," she murmured, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He reached for her hand, giving it a light squeeze before leading her inside. The lobby was a masterpiece of extravagance, with gleaming crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings and polished marble floors reflecting the golden glow of ornate sconces. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits milled about, their laughter and conversation blending into a hum of aristocratic elegance. A woman in a sleek black dress stood behind the reception desk, efficiently directing guests to their assigned tables. Claire and Daniel approached, and the woman, without looking up, reached for the stack of name tags arranged in precise alphabetical order. "Name, please," she asked. "Daniel and Claire Adams," Daniel replied smoothly. The receptionist's manicured fingers skimmed through the neatly printed cards before pulling one out. She handed it over with a polite, well-practiced smile. Claire reached for it, then froze. The name printed on the card wasn't Claire Adams. It was Claire Adams, housekeeper. The words stood starkly against the crisp white card, as though they had been deliberately placed to ensure she would see them, feel them. Her fingers clenched around the edges of the card as a slow wave of heat spread through her chest. A strange, eerie quiet settled in her ears, muting the surrounding chatter and music. She turned toward Margaret, who stood a few feet away, watching with unreadable detachment. Juliet, wrapped in a designer wedding gown worth more than Claire's entire savings, stood beside her, her expression unreadable for only a moment before it curled into a smirk. Margaret spoke first. "Oh, dear, there must have been some mistake." But there was no surprise in her voice. No concern. Only smooth, practiced indifference. Claire's grip on the name tag tightened. "A mistake?" "No, not a mistake. A message." She glanced around, suddenly aware of the hushed whispers, the sidelong glances. Guests who had seen the tag, who had seen the moment unfold, were now exchanging knowing looks. A flush of humiliation crawled up Claire's neck. Daniel, noticing the shift in her expression, took the tag from her hands and read it. His face darkened instantly. "What the hell is this?" Margaret's perfectly plucked brows lifted. "Calm down, Daniel. It's nothing to make a scene over." "A scene?" His voice sharpened. "You humiliate my wife in front of everyone and call it nothing?" Claire inhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady her breathing. This was not the moment for anger. Anger would only feed into their narrative. Claire, the outsider who couldn't handle their world. She took the tag back from Daniel and slipped it into her pocket, her movements slow, deliberate. Then, she met Margaret's gaze directly. "I suppose this is your way of reminding me of my place," she said quietly, her voice even. Margaret tilted her head, an almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of her lips. Oh, Claire. If you're this sensitive, perhaps you weren't meant for this family after all. The words landed like a slap, but Claire refused to let them show. Daniel took a step forward, his jaw clenched. Apologize. Now. Margaret's expression didn't waver. For what? A printing error. Juliet let out a soft, amused laugh. Oh, Daniel, don't be so dramatic. This is my wedding day. Can't we focus on that instead of petty misunderstandings? Claire watched them, Margaret's calculated poise, Juliet's careless cruelty, and suddenly, something inside her shifted. For years, she had let them define her worth. She had smiled through their condescension, absorbed their thinly veiled insults, endured the dismissive glances, all for the sake of peace. For Daniel. For the marriage she had fought so hard to protect. But tonight, she realized something. She wasn't protecting her marriage. She was erasing herself to fit into a world that never wanted her. And she was done. Claire exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest lifting, replaced by something colder, clearer. She turned to Daniel, her voice steady, quiet. I don't want to fight tonight. Daniel looked at her, his anger still simmering, but he nodded. He understood. But what he didn't know, what she barely understood herself, was that this wasn't about avoiding a fight. It was about choosing herself for the first time in 5 years. With that, Claire squared her shoulders and walked past Margaret and Juliet, her head held high, as if their words and their cruelty had never touched her at all. Inside the ballroom, the celebration was already in full swing. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and uniformed waiters glided between guests carrying trays of champagne. Laughter, chatter, the clinking of fine china, all of it swirled around Claire as she moved through the crowd, an observer rather than a participant. She took her place at the family table, seated beside Daniel. But something was different now. The chair beneath her felt colder, the weight of their stares heavier. As the first course was served, Claire reached for her fork, only to realize there was no plate in front of her. Her hands froze midair. She glanced around. Every other guest at the table had been served except her. The waiter hesitated, then leaned toward her with an apologetic whisper. I'm so sorry, ma'am, but your meal wasn't included in the head count. Claire blinked. Margaret, across the table, took a delicate sip of her wine, watching the moment unfold with something close to satisfaction. Juliet leaned in, her voice barely audible over the music. Oh, Claire, meals are only for real family members. And that was it. The final straw. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't demand an explanation. Instead, with slow, deliberate precision, she reached for her left hand. She twisted her wedding ring, once a symbol of love, of promises, of the life she had tried to build. And then, she slid it off. She placed it on the table, the small band gleaming under the chandelier's light. The chatter around them faded. The clinking glasses stilled. Silence. Claire met Margaret's eyes, her voice unwavering. If I'm not family, then I don't belong here. Then, without another word, she rose from her chair, turned, and walked away. She didn't look back. Not at the stunned expressions. Not at Juliet's shocked silence. Not at Daniel, whose breath had just caught in his throat. She walked out of the ballroom, out of the Grand Windsor, and into the night, where the cold air hit her like a second awakening. She had spent 5 years fighting to belong. Tonight, she chose something else. Herself. The night air was crisp against Claire's skin as she stepped onto the cobblestone driveway outside the Grand Windsor. The distant hum of traffic and the faint laughter of wedding guests behind her felt like echoes of a world she had just abandoned. Her heels clicked softly as she walked forward, each step carrying a newfound sense of weight and liberation. Her wedding ring, once a symbol of love and devotion, was no longer on her finger. It sat on that pristine white tablecloth inside the ballroom, a quiet declaration of everything she had endured, everything she had finally let go of. Claire exhaled, her breath visible in the cool air. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the chill, but to steady the storm swirling in her chest. A part of her had expected Margaret to follow her, to demand she return, to smooth over the scene as if it had never happened. But she knew better. Margaret would never run after someone she considered unworthy. And Daniel? Claire had no answer for that. Her heart clenched as she imagined his expression, the stunned silence, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Had he truly thought she would endure this forever? That she would keep swallowing the cruelty of his family, night after night, year after year? A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Not tonight. She stepped toward the street, half considering calling a cab, but before she could reach for her phone, the heavy oak doors behind her swung open. Claire. She froze at the sound of her name. Turning slowly, she saw Eleanor Hayes, the future mother-in-law of Juliet, descending the steps toward her. The woman moved with the effortless grace of someone born into wealth, but there was something different about her, something genuine. Unlike Margaret, Eleanor's eyes held no malice, no cold judgment. Claire straightened. Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor's expression softened. Call me Eleanor, please. Claire nodded, unsure of what to say. Eleanor stopped a few feet away, tilting her head as she studied Claire. Then, with a quiet sigh, she reached into the small clutch at her side and pulled out something. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. Her wedding ring. Eleanor held it out, her voice gentle. I saw what happened in there. Claire hesitated, staring at the ring. The delicate band of gold, the small but meaningful diamond. Once, it had been everything to her. Now, it felt like a remnant of a past she wasn't sure she could return to. I'm not taking it back, Claire said, her voice firmer than she expected. Eleanor nodded, closing her fingers around the ring instead. I understand. Claire studied the older woman, searching for any hint of condescension, but found none. What they did to you tonight, Eleanor continued, her voice laced with quiet anger, was cruel. It was calculated. And it was wrong. Claire swallowed. She had expected whispers, pitying glances, but not this, not someone standing beside her. Eleanor took a step closer, lowering her voice. You handled it with dignity, Claire. More than I can say for them. Claire let out a small, breathless laugh, though there was no humor in it. Dignity? She shook her head. I just walked out of my own marriage. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. No, you walked away from people who never valued you. There's a difference. Something inside Claire cracked. For so long, she had been questioning herself, wondering if she had been too sensitive, too weak, too unwilling to play by their rules. But here was someone who saw it for what it truly was. She looked down at Eleanor's closed hand, where the ring rested inside her palm. What do I do now? Claire asked, her voice quieter. Eleanor gave her a knowing look. You take time. You breathe. And when you're ready, you decide what you want on your terms. Claire exhaled slowly. The doors behind them opened again, and this time, a new voice filled the night air. Claire. She turned just as Daniel strode down the steps, his expression a mixture of urgency and regret. Eleanor stepped aside, offering Claire a small nod before slipping the ring into Claire's hand and retreating back inside, leaving them alone. Daniel stopped a foot away, his chest rising and falling as if he had run all the way from the ballroom. Claire, he hesitated, searching for the right words. Claire tightened her fingers around the ring, feeling its cool weight in her palm. I'm sorry, Daniel finally said, his voice raw. I should have stopped them. I should have defended you sooner. Claire's throat tightened. Why didn't you? Daniel looked away, raking a hand through his hair. Because I thought if we just endured it, if we ignored them, they would stop. That one day, they'd accept you. Claire let out a bitter laugh. Accept me? She shook her head. Daniel, they never planned to. They never wanted me here. He exhaled, his hands flexing at his sides. I know. His voice cracked slightly. And I let it happen. I let them hurt you over and over again. Claire stared at him, waiting for something, an excuse, a justification. But there was none. Just Daniel, standing before her, raw and exposed in a way she had never seen before. I'm done, Daniel, she said finally, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. His head snapped up. Claire, please. I can't keep doing this. She inhaled sharply. I can't keep waiting for them to change, waiting for you to choose me when you should have done it years ago. Daniel's eyes darkened with regret. I did choose you. Claire shook her head. No. You chose to keep the peace. And I was the cost of that peace. Silence stretched between them, thick with all the things left unsaid. Finally, Daniel's shoulders slumped. So, this is it? His voice was barely above a whisper. Claire looked down at the ring in her palm, then back at him. I don't know, she admitted. But I need time to figure it out. Daniel nodded slowly, pain etched across his face. Okay. Claire took a step back, the space between them growing, shifting. She turned, walking away into the night, leaving the echoes of the Grand Windsor and everything it represented behind her. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, she felt free. The night air was still crisp when Claire stepped into the quiet street outside the Grand Windsor. The echoes of the wedding's laughter and music drifted faintly through the grand doors behind her, but she no longer belonged to that world. She didn't look back. Each step away from the venue felt lighter, though the weight in her chest remained. The ring still sat in her palm, its small, cold shape pressing against her skin as she clenched her fingers around it. She wasn't sure why she had taken it when Eleanor handed it to her, but she had. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of uncertainty, or maybe because she wasn't quite ready to let go completely. But one thing was certain, she was done being humiliated. She had no idea where she was going. She just needed to walk. Needed to breathe. The city lights stretched before her, offering their silent company as she moved through the unfamiliar streets. It wasn't until she reached a small cafe at the corner of a quiet intersection that she realized her hands were shaking. She exhaled, forcing herself to steady her breath, then pushed open the door. Inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapped around her. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of mugs, and the rich scent of coffee grounded her in the present. A handful of people occupied the space. Couples leaning in close, students hunched over laptops, a few solo patrons lost in their own thoughts. She walked to the counter and ordered a cup of chamomile tea. Something soothing. Something to settle the storm raging inside her. As she waited, she pulled out her phone. Missed calls from Daniel. A text from him that simply read, "Claire, please talk to me." She turned the screen face down. She wasn't ready. The barista handed her the tea, and she found a corner table by the window. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her palms. She had left the wedding, left the family that had never wanted her. And yet, here she was, alone in a cafe, wondering what came next. Claire? She looked up, startled. Eleanor Hayes stood beside her table, still in her elegant evening gown, but there was something softer about her now, something less polished, less distant. Claire blinked. Mrs. Hayes? Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. I thought we agreed on Eleanor. Claire nodded slowly. Right. Sorry. I just wasn't expecting to see you here. Eleanor gestured toward the empty seat across from her. May I? Claire hesitated before nodding. Of course. Eleanor settled into the chair, smoothing the fabric of her dress before folding her hands neatly in front of her. I left the wedding not long after you did. Claire frowned. Why? Eleanor's expression darkened slightly. Because I don't stand by cruelty, and what Margaret and Juliet did tonight was exactly that. Claire looked down at her tea, unsure of what to say. Eleanor continued. You know, when Lucas first introduced Juliet to our family, I had my doubts. She's beautiful, charming when she wants to be, but, she sighed. There's a certain entitlement there. A belief that kindness is optional. I hoped it was just nerves, or that she'd mature with time. But tonight proved otherwise. Claire studied the woman across from her. Eleanor's presence had always seemed effortless, graceful, composed, untouchable. But now she seemed disappointed. Lucas? Claire asked. Eleanor's lips pressed together. He saw what happened. He was horrified. He's questioning everything now. Claire's breath caught. You mean? Eleanor nodded. The wedding may not happen at all. A long silence stretched between them. Claire should have felt satisfaction. Should have felt vindicated. But all she felt was exhaustion. This wasn't what I wanted, she admitted softly. Eleanor's gaze softened. I know. Claire exhaled. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. And did you? Claire hesitated, then shook her head. No. Eleanor reached across the table and placed a gentle hand over Claire's. Then leaving was the right choice. The words settled over Claire like a quiet truth she had been avoiding. Eleanor leaned back. You don't have to decide anything tonight. But if you ever need support, know that you have it. Claire looked at her, surprised. Why do you care? Eleanor smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. Because I've seen too many women sacrifice themselves for families who don't deserve them. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Eleanor stood. I should go. But, Claire? Claire looked up. If you decide to walk away for good, don't do it out of anger. Do it because you know you deserve better. Claire nodded slowly. Thank you. Eleanor gave her one last smile before turning and walking out into the night. Claire watched her go, then looked down at the ring in her hand. For the first time, she saw it clearly, not as a symbol of love, but as a reminder of everything she had endured. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it go. Claire sat in the dim glow of the cafe for what felt like hours, her fingers tracing the smooth edges of the wedding ring in her palm. The tea had long gone cold, the once busy cafe now quieter, only a few lingering customers remaining. The words Eleanor had spoken echoed in her mind. If you decide to walk away for good, don't do it out of anger. Do it because you know you deserve better. Did she? Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar vibration of her phone. She glanced down at the screen. Another call from Daniel. This time, she didn't ignore it. She hesitated before answering, bringing the phone to her ear. Daniel. A sigh of relief came through the line. Claire. Where are you? Are you okay? She exhaled slowly, staring out the window at the passing headlights. I'm fine. A pause. Where are you? She considered lying, saying she was already home. But she was too tired for that. A cafe downtown. There was another pause, then, I'm coming. Before she could object, the line went dead. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the phone in her hand. She didn't know what she was expecting from this conversation, but she wasn't ready for another argument. Minutes passed, then the bell above the cafe door chimed. She didn't have to look up to know it was Daniel. He spotted her immediately, his gaze sweeping the cafe before landing on her. He exhaled, striding toward her, looking both relieved and cautious. He still wore his suit from the wedding, though his tie was loosened, his usual polished composure slightly frayed. Claire, he said as he reached her table. She gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit. He did, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. He studied her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. I was worried. Claire sighed. I needed time to think. He nodded. I understand. He hesitated, then, Claire, what happened tonight? She cut him off, her voice calm but firm. Was a breaking point. Daniel's jaw tightened. I know. She studied him. Do you? His shoulders sank slightly, his fingers tightening around each other. Yes, he admitted. I should have stopped them a long time ago. Claire waited. Daniel exhaled sharply. I thought that if we ignored them, if we focused on us, they'd eventually come around. That things would get better. She shook her head. They never would have. And you knew that. He ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. I did. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that my own family, my mother, could be so cruel to the person I love. Claire's chest tightened. Do you? His head snapped up, his expression raw. Claire, of course I love you. She swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. Then why did you let them make me feel like I was nothing? His face twisted in pain. Because I was a coward, he admitted. Because I was afraid that if I stood up to them, I'd lose them. And in trying to hold on to both, I ended up hurting you. Claire felt something inside her crack. She had wanted him to say those words for so long, to acknowledge that his silence had been just as painful as their insults. She looked down at the ring still in her palm. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Daniel. His hands clenched into fists. Please don't say that. She lifted her gaze to his. Then tell me, what changes now? What happens when Margaret calls next week? When Juliet finds a new way to humiliate me? Do I just keep enduring it while you look the other way? Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Claire watched in confusion as he scrolled for a moment before placing it on the table between them. The screen showed his text messages, specifically, one he had just typed but not yet sent. Mom, we're done. Until you respect Claire as my wife, you won't hear from me again. Claire's breath caught. She looked at Daniel, eyes wide. You mean this? His gaze was unwavering. I do. Her heart pounded. You'd cut them off? I should have done it years ago. He swallowed hard. Claire, I'm choosing you. Not them. Not their approval. Just you. For the first time, Claire saw it, the weight of the decision in his eyes, the finality of it. He wasn't just saying words. He was ready to back them up with action. He exhaled. I love you, Claire. And I know I don't deserve forgiveness yet. But I want to fight for us. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Claire reached forward, her fingers brushing against his phone. She stared at the message for a long moment before nodding. Send it. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pressed send. Claire exhaled, the tension in her shoulders finally loosening. Daniel covered her hand with his grip warm, steady. Let's start over, he whispered. For the first time in a long time, Claire believed they just might. The rhythmic hum of the car engine filled the silence between Claire and Daniel as they drove back home. The streets of the city blurred past, golden streetlights casting fleeting shadows inside the car. Claire sat with her hands folded in her lap, her mind still processing everything that had happened at the wedding, at the cafe, everything Daniel had just done. She had waited years for him to take a stand. And now that he had, she didn't quite know how to feel. Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. Are you okay? He asked, his voice careful. Claire inhaled deeply. I don't know, she admitted. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even heartbroken. Just tired. Exhausted from years of bending herself into something smaller just to fit into his family. Daniel nodded as if he understood. I meant what I said back there, he murmured. About choosing you. Claire turned her head to study him. His profile was tense, his jaw tight, but his hands on the wheel were steady. She wanted to believe him. But belief wasn't built in a single night. She sighed, leaning back against the seat. I know. Silence settled between them again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was simply there, a space neither of them knew how to fill just yet. When they finally reached their apartment, Claire hesitated before stepping out of the car. It felt strange to return home after everything. The weight of the night clung to her like an old coat, suffocating and familiar. Daniel waited for her at the door, unlocking it as she stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, untouched by the chaos of the evening. For the first time since leaving the wedding, Claire allowed herself to exhale. She slipped off her shoes, rubbing her sore feet. Daniel followed suit, loosening his tie before leaning against the counter. I could make some tea, he offered. Claire gave him a small, tired smile. That would be nice. He moved into the kitchen, the sound of water filling the kettle breaking the silence. She watched him, the quiet way he worked, the effort he was making, even in the smallest things. Her eyes drifted to the coffee table, where a wedding photo of them sat in a silver frame. A different time, a different version of them. Could they find their way back to that? Or had too much already been broken? The kettle whistled, and Daniel poured 2 cups, handing one to her. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin. Finally, she spoke. I need time, Daniel. His expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of emotion in his eyes. He nodded slowly. I understand. Claire sighed. It's not just about what happened tonight. It's everything. Years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I had to prove myself over and over again. She shook her head. I don't know if I can just let that go overnight. Daniel looked down at his cup. I don't expect you to. She studied him. Then what do you expect? He met her gaze, something raw in his eyes. To prove that I'm not the man who let that happen anymore. Claire swallowed, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling briefly before showing her the screen. It was an article from a major news outlet. Hayes family announces charitable fund for healthcare workers. Claire blinked, scanning the article. William and Eleanor Hayes had publicly launched a fund dedicated to supporting nurses and frontline medical staff, a direct response to the humiliation she had endured at Juliet's wedding. She stared at the words, her mind struggling to process them. They did this? Daniel nodded. Eleanor called me earlier. She and William decided that if their name was going to be attached to the Donovans, they wanted to make it clear where they stood. Claire exhaled. And Lucas? Daniel hesitated. He postponed the wedding. Claire's eyes widened. Postponed? Indefinitely, Daniel clarified. He told Juliet that until she understands why what she did was wrong, he can't move forward with the marriage. Claire leaned back against the couch, running a hand through her hair. I never wanted this, she murmured. Daniel nodded. I know. She stared down at her tea, the steam curling softly into the air. And Margaret? A pause. Daniel sighed. She's furious, of course. But more than that, she's shaken. She didn't expect any of this to backfire. She thought she could keep treating you the way she always has and that nothing would ever change. Claire let out a dry laugh. I guess she was wrong. Daniel hesitated before reaching out, placing his hand gently over hers. Claire. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I know words don't fix anything. But I want you to know that I'm done protecting them at your expense. I'm done pretending they'll change on their own. He swallowed hard. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. Claire studied him, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty. But all she saw was sincerity. She turned her hand over, letting their fingers intertwine. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Juliet's wedding the night everything changed. Claire had spent the time quietly, allowing herself to breathe, to think, to exist outside the constant pressure of the Donovans. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was walking on eggshells. Daniel had kept his promise. He had cut off all financial support to Margaret and refused to speak with her unless she acknowledged her actions and apologized. Claire knew how much it had cost him, how much he had always wanted to be a good son, even when it meant sacrificing his own happiness. Now, he had chosen differently. And Margaret? Claire hadn't heard from her. Until tonight. She stepped out of Riverside General Hospital after her shift, the cool evening air hitting her skin like a gentle wake-up call. The day had been long, but fulfilling. Her patients needed her, and here, in the hospital, she knew her worth. She reached her car and froze. Margaret Donovan stood beside it. Claire's grip on her bag tightened. Margaret looked different. Her usual pristine, untouchable elegance was faded, replaced by something more tired. Her makeup was still impeccable, but there were shadows under her eyes, and the lines on her face seemed more pronounced. Claire took a breath, keeping her voice steady. What are you doing here, Margaret? Margaret let out a slow breath, clasping her hands in front of her. I needed to see you. Claire arched a brow. After 3 weeks of silence? Margaret's lips pressed together. Yes. She hesitated, then added, May I speak with you for a moment? Claire studied her for a long beat. Margaret Donovan was not a woman who begged, and she certainly wasn't one who admitted fault. If she was here, outside Claire's workplace, it meant something. Claire unlocked her car but didn't get in. I'm listening. Margaret nodded slightly, as if bracing herself. I want to apologize. Claire felt something flicker in her chest, something that might have been shock if she hadn't trained herself never to expect kindness from this woman. Margaret continued, her voice quieter than Claire had ever heard it. I know that may not mean much to you, but I realize now that I've been cruel. Claire crossed her arms. Cruel? You had me labeled as a housekeeper at my sister-in-law's wedding, Margaret. That wasn't just cruel, it was humiliating. Margaret winced, but didn't argue. Yes, it was. Silence stretched between them. Claire didn't fill it. If Margaret was going to say her piece, she would have to do it without Claire making it easier for her. Margaret sighed. When Daniel cut me off, I thought he was just making a statement. That he'd eventually give in. She shook her head, almost to herself. But he didn't. Claire's expression didn't change. No, he didn't. Margaret glanced away for a moment before meeting Claire's gaze again. I lost my home, she admitted. I had to sell Briarwood. Claire blinked. Of all the things she had expected, this wasn't one of them. Margaret let out a dry chuckle, devoid of humor. Do you know how humiliating it is to go from a mansion to a modest apartment? To watch the world you built slip away because of your own mistakes. Claire exhaled slowly. Yes, she said quietly. I do. Margaret's expression shifted, something like realization dawning in her eyes. Claire continued. I spent 5 years trying to prove myself to you. 5 years trying to belong in a family that never wanted me. And no matter how much I gave, how much I endured, it was never enough. She met Margaret's gaze, steady and unyielding. So yes, I know exactly what it feels like to be humiliated. To feel like you're losing everything. Margaret swallowed. Claire shook her head. What changed? Margaret hesitated, then said, Lucas. After he postponed the wedding, I expected Juliet to throw a tantrum, to demand that he fix it. But she didn't. She sighed. She actually listened to him. And to Eleanor. Claire's brows lifted slightly. Juliet? Listened? Margaret gave a small, weary smile. I know. Shocking. She exhaled. She's been reflecting on everything, and for the first time, I realized, maybe I should too. Claire let the words settle before asking, and what do you expect from me? Margaret shook her head. Nothing, she sighed. I don't deserve anything from you. Not forgiveness. Not kindness. But I needed to say this, to tell you that I see what I've done. And I regret it. Claire studied her. She didn't know if she fully believed Margaret's remorse, but she saw something real in her eyes. Something that hadn't been there before. Finally, Claire spoke. Trust takes time to rebuild. Margaret nodded slowly. I understand. They stood there, 2 women who had spent years at odds, now facing something neither had anticipated. Finally, Margaret took a step back. Thank you for listening. Claire nodded but said nothing. Margaret turned and walked toward a waiting car. Claire stood there for a long moment after she left, her thoughts tangled. She didn't know if Margaret had truly changed. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. The smell of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread filled the small apartment as Claire set the table, arranging the simple ceramic plates with quiet precision. The act felt foreign, dining with Margaret Donovan in a setting so modest compared to the grandeur of Briarwood. Yet, here they were. Margaret sat at the tiny dining table, her hands resting in her lap. She looked smaller than Claire remembered, as though the weight of her new reality had stripped away the armor she once wore so effortlessly. Daniel entered from the kitchen, carrying a steaming dish of roasted chicken. He set it down and took the seat beside Claire, his gaze flicking between his mother and his wife. The tension in the air was thick, but different from the past. This wasn't an evening filled with veiled insults or forced pleasantries. It was something else entirely, an attempt at something new. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice softer than Claire had ever heard. This looks lovely. Claire didn't respond immediately. She was still adjusting to this version of Margaret, one who had lost the power she once wielded so mercilessly. Daniel gave Claire a small nod, silently encouraging her to speak. Thank you, Claire said, her voice steady. I hope you like it. Margaret offered a tentative smile. I'm sure I will. Dinner began in relative silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound in the room. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't unbearable either. It was neutral. Margaret took a slow sip of water before setting her glass down. Juliet wanted me to tell you that she's sorry. Claire looked up, her fork pausing midair. She did? Margaret nodded. She's still processing everything. But she realizes now that she was unfair. She exhaled. More than unfair. Claire placed her fork down, studying Margaret carefully. And you? Margaret met her gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, she said, I spent years believing I was protecting my family. That I was ensuring Daniel's future by guiding him toward the life I thought he should have. She swallowed. I didn't realize I was destroying something far more important. Daniel shifted beside Claire, but he said nothing. He was letting this moment belong to them. Margaret continued. When I lost Briarwood, I expected to feel anger, bitterness. Instead, I just felt empty. Because for the first time, I had to ask myself, what was I really left with? Claire's throat tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Margaret sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. I don't expect things to be easy between us. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I do want to try. Claire inhaled deeply. For so long, she had wanted to hear these words. She had wanted Margaret to see her, to acknowledge the hurt she had inflicted. But now that the moment was here, it wasn't the triumphant victory she had imagined. It was just real. I don't know how to move forward from this, Claire admitted quietly. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. Margaret nodded slowly. I understand. Silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was contemplative, careful. Daniel reached for Claire's hand beneath the table, squeezing gently. A silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Margaret cleared her throat, forcing a small smile. I cooked for the first time last week. Daniel blinked. You cooked. Margaret gave a soft chuckle. If you can call it that. I burned half of it. But I'm learning. Claire tilted her head. Why? Margaret exhaled. Because I never had to before. And now, well, I don't have a house full of staff anymore. She hesitated. It's humbling. Claire studied her. She wasn't sure she'd ever feel close to Margaret, but she could respect honesty. I could give you a few recipes, Claire offered. Margaret looked surprised. You would? Claire gave a small nod. If we're going to try, we might as well start somewhere. A slow, genuine smile spread across Margaret's face. I'd like that. And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. But it was a start.